In this video, I'm going to go through some synthesis and transformation questions, which we have covered in our Primary 5 class in the year 2022. The first question would contain the very common clause, neither nor. It is a very common question type that often appears in Primary 4, Primary 5, and Primary 6 examinations. Jim does not want to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. He does not want to climb Mount Everest either. The first thing we have to do is to identify the two options. So he doesn't want to climb this mountain, Mount Kilimanjaro, which is in Africa. He also does not want to climb Mount Everest, which is a mountain along the border of Nepal and Tibet. So we next have to identify what's common. He does not want to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. Now, he also does not want to climb Mount Everest. So that is common and it shouldn't be repeated in our transformed sentence. And the last thing that we have to take note is that we do not write the word not anymore, because neither nor already has the meaning, it already has not inside. So it is very important for us not to have the word not when we are writing the answer for neither nor questions. So in this case, the transformed answer would be Jim wants to climb neither Mount Kilimanjaro nor Mount Everest. It doesn't matter which you put first. You could say Jim wants to climb neither Mount Everest nor Mount Kilimanjaro, and that would be fine as well. The two options can be interchanged in positions. As I said earlier, the first option is Mount Kilimanjaro. The second option would be Mount Everest, and it doesn't matter what order we put it. It could be Mount Kilimanjaro first, or it could be Mount Everest first. And it is really important that we consider subject-verb agreement. Jim is only one person, so we should be using wants here. Jim wants. Now, the reason why it's want here, why we are using the root word, is because there's a word does. So after do and does, we must always use the root word. So for example, we do not eat durians. So in this case, because eat is after the word do or does, we make sure that we use the root word. So let me give you another example. Mrs. Lee does not eat durians. Now in this case, Mrs. Lee is a singular noun. However, because there is the word do or does, we use the root word, which is eat, instead of eats, even though Mrs. Lee is a singular noun. Because if you recall, usually for singular noun, we use the word which ends with S. We will add an S behind. So for example, he eats durians. Mrs. Lee eats durians. Okay, so if there's no does, we would say Mrs. Lee eats durians. Now let's go back to the neither nor type of questions. It is very important for us to delete the word not, otherwise we would not do justice to the original meaning of the question. Because if we do not delete the word not, it actually means the opposite, right? Which is that Jim does not want to climb neither Mount Kilimanjaro nor Mount Everest, which means that he is actually fine with climbing either mountain. So we must be really careful. Let me give you another example to make this really clear. So sometimes it's not about cancelling the word not, sometimes it's about using an antonym. So for example, Jim hates durians. Jim hates pineapples too. Maybe some of you hate durians as well because of the smell, and maybe some of you hate pineapples too because it can be sour sometimes. So the transformed sentence would involve us changing hates to likes. So hates and likes, they are antonyms. They have the opposite meanings. So the transformed sentence would be Jim likes neither durians nor pineapples. We need to cancel the word to. It's redundant, and we shouldn't have the word to in our transformed answer. So Jim likes neither durians nor pineapples. Now, if we say Jim hates neither durians nor pineapples, it means that he is fine with both. But of course, that is not the intended meaning. He is not fine with durians, he's not fine with pineapples. So when we say Jim hates neither durian nor pineapples, that actually does not do justice to the original meaning behind the sentences that are provided in the exam. So we must be really careful when we do neither nor questions, and we'll discuss these in greater detail in our classes. Tom is keen on scaling Mount Everest. Tom is also keen on scaling Mount Kilimanjaro. The transformed sentence would not include a repetition of keen on because we see Tom is keen on in both sentences. So we must be really careful to put that in front. So Tom is keen on scaling either option 1, which is Mount Everest, or option 2, which is Mount Kilimanjaro. An incorrect answer would be Tom is keen on either scaling Mount Everest or scaling Mount Kilimanjaro. Now, this is incorrect and will be not given any marks because scaling is repeated. So this is very long-winded. The best answer would involve you taking out what is common and putting it in front. Tom is keen on scaling either Mount Everest or Mount Kilimanjaro. We now move on to questions that start with despite. When questions start with despite, we must be careful to have a word that ends with ing after the word despite, or we could have a noun after the word despite. So for example, in this case, the answer would be, despite preparing for a very long time, they did not reach the summit. And the summit actually means the highest point, the apex of the mountain. So despite preparing for a very long time, they did not reach the summit. We could also follow despite with a noun. So for example, despite her struggle, she did not manage to pass the examination. All right, or you could say despite her preparations. So her preparations, her intense or grueling preparations. So despite her grueling preparations, she did not manage to pass the examination. So grueling has this idea that you spend a lot of energy doing it and you're really tired, all right? It's very tedious. So her grueling preparations here would actually be a noun, and that would follow the word despite, and of course that is grammatically proper. Now let's try although. Although actually means even though. So the transform sentence will be, although they prepared for a very long time, they did not reach the summit. There is a shortcut that may not be accepted by some teachers for the word despite, because usually for despite, there is some amount of transformation that is needed to be done. Now you realize that for although, we didn't really transform the sentence much. The sentence more or less remains the same. They prepared for a very long time. They prepared for a very long time. They did not reach the summit. They did not reach the summit. Not much change. However, for despite, you realize that there is some amount of change that is required. Now, in order to do away with the change or to make life easier, some teachers actually teach this, despite the fact that. This is not accepted in some schools, even though it is accepted in the PSLE examinations. So the answer, the possible answer would be, despite the fact that they prepared for a very long time, they did not reach the summit. So this is some sort of a cheat in some way, because there is no need then for you to rephrase. They prepared for a very long time is lifted. They prepared for a very long time. So despite the fact that they prepared for a very long time, they did not reach the summit. Let's move on to the next type of question, which is no matter. No matter is a very common type of question. In this case, no matter would be followed with how. So no matter how hard she tried, she could not breathe. As you go higher and higher up the mountain, it becomes harder and harder for you to breathe. No matter can also be followed by words such as no matter where. No matter where she searched, she could not find her book. Now, what about a transformation which involves the word although at the center? The answer would be, she could not breathe, although she tried as hard as she could. Although actually means even though. And sometimes although is at the middle of the sentence, other times although is at the start of the sentence. So if although were at the start of the sentence, we would say although she could not breathe, although she tried as hard as she could not breathe. As you just realized, the order is very, very important. Even though she tried so hard, she could not breathe. So if although were at the start of the sentence, we would copy this part verbatim. That means exactly. And start with a capital letter A. So although she tried as hard as she could not breathe. Before and after questions are really common in primary 4. So in this primary 5 worksheet, we actually try to recap this concept with our students. The order is very important. We must pack carefully. This is the first thing in the temporal sequence. The first thing in time is packing carefully. The second thing in time is going on the expedition. So the first event being packing carefully, and the second event being going on the expedition. And an expedition is simply a journey. So before we can go on the expedition, we must pack carefully. It is imperative that we have the order right. For before questions, we always put the second event first. And then we put the first event in time later in the chronological sequence. That means the second event in time appears first before we can go on the expedition, and then followed by the first event in time. We must pack carefully. Let me give you a very simple example. Before we go to sleep, we must brush our teeth. It is quite obvious that we brush our teeth and then we go to sleep. So the second event actually comes first. Before we go to sleep, we must brush our teeth. After is so much easier because the answer follows the same sequence as the natural sequence in time. So for example, after we pack carefully, we can go on the expedition. It is very, very important when we do synthesis that every single detail has to be included. So students should mention the word carefully. After we pack carefully, we can go on the expedition. In this case, the word must is eliminated from our answer. I hope that this was helpful. You can visit our website, www.apexeducators.com, for more information on our courses, which are available for primary school students all the way to JC students in terms of the general paper and JC Physics, JC Math, and so on. Have a Merry Christmas.